I will get into the weeds on one player because I've just been so impressed by him. Alex Laferriere.
Laferriere shoots, score! Hit tackle! Yeah. For Dubois and Angola, chance, kicked out, rebound, score!
Did you have any sense when he was being scouted, when you drafted him, even when he was playing at Harvard, that he might come in and command that much attention?
So we'll sit in the summer and we'll say, okay, what are our priorities on our prospects right now? Which ones are aging out of junior? Which ones are getting close to being, either a junior or senior in college? He was a priority because they felt he was very close to being able to be pro.
Zone leaves it back for Laferriere. Alex Laferriere, a backhand score!
Now the long pass for Laferriere. He goes in. Shot!
He sees Laferriere calling for it. He's got a 2-on-1. Laferriere gets the pass in between the stick and the skates of the defenseman Gustafson. Watch right here. He goes right in between them.
What is the biggest adjustment coming from Harvard to playing, his just on ice and off ice?
Yeah, on ice I would say probably the speed. It's definitely a lot faster, and the guys are bigger and stronger and have better sticks. And I mean, everyone says it, it's kind of cliche, but it's definitely true. And then off ice, I think just the lifestyle, obviously the flying is a lot different all the time. You're flying right after the games and stuff like that. So being able to keep your body in check and stuff like that. But I think the older guys have done a great job of kind of showing me the ropes, so it's been good.
There's always that concern with a college player that the schedule will eat you up at some point. And perhaps that will be the case. Then you go through that wall. You come out the other side, hopefully a better player. When I see Alex Laferriere, the first thing that comes to mind, and it's just a kind of a general statement, and people, when I say it, they go, well, of course. He looks like a hockey player. There's just something about his game that he doesn't have to be as dynamic as a Kevin Fiala. He doesn't have to be as stable as a Mikey Anderson. He just goes about his business and he looks like he belongs.
Met by Fiala, the puck out to center ice, picked up Laferriere, moves in on a defender, Sanheim, but he couldn't get around the defenseman with the puck. Now he's got it back, feeds the middle, Lazat shoots, and scores!
All that enthusiasm, the first goal, the first game, it normalizes a little bit for players, and now you have to keep going. I don't want to say it becomes work, because this is great work for all of us, but you have to be able to keep playing and bring that energy and that excitement over and over again, and I think he can do that.
He's been playing great. He's been doing a lot of stuff right. Almost kind of like, Q last year. We didn't see him on the score sheet a whole lot, but he was doing a lot of stuff right, playing the right way, playing good games.
When you get the puck, you're expected to do something with it. You're not just expected to give it back to your line mates and defer to them. And that happens quite a bit with young players. So I think if there's one thing I notice with Alex more than most is when he has room on the ice, he takes that room.
Nice move, the rookie Laferriere, room, in, feeds Deneau, shoots, scores! Deneau from Laferriere.
Because he was not a first-round pick, it certainly would be a bonus to the Kings if he could just keep progressing the way he has. More and more and more and more situations that he's put into, well, who knows, maybe he gets some power play time sooner or later, then that confidence hopefully continues to build.